In an interview with Vox, Bernie Sanders recently spoke out about our corrupt campaign finance system. Now here's a brief clip of that.
Candidates are increasingly dependent on the very, very wealthy. And I'm proud, by the way, that the vast majority of our money comes from working people. But if I'm a normal politician who needs to raise $20, $50 million, where am I going to go? I'm going to sit down with the wealthy. I'm going to go to the country club. I'm going to do my fundraisers at fancy resorts. And I get to know those people. But that's the whole point of this corrupt campaign finance system. If you're going to contribute $1 million to my super PAC, well, maybe you're a hell of a nice guy and you like to participate. Or maybe you want something. I think you want something. And you and I are going to become really good buddies so I can do your bidding. In other words, the millionaire class and the billionaire class increasingly own the political process and they own the politicians who go to them for money. And I worry very much, and I say this from the bottom of my heart, that we are moving very, very quickly from a democratic society, one person, one vote, to an oligarchic form of society where billionaires will be determining who the elected officials of this country are. I'm going to do everything I can to stop that.
When you say you want to see elections be publicly funded, do you want to cut the ability to privately fund them?
The first thing that I want to do is overturn the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which is a total disaster. Free speech does not equal the ability of people to buy elections. And what I have said is, if elected President of the United States, any Supreme Court nominee I make will make it very clear that he or she is going to vote to overturn Citizens United. Second of all, I think what you want to do is at least make sure that candidates who are running will have as much money as their opponents who may have unlimited sums of money. Thirdly, I think there are various ways that you can approach the issue. One way, which I find intriguing, is that you either give a tax credit or basically provide $100 for every citizen in the United States of America. And you say to that person, here's your $100. You can make a contribution. You're going to get a $100 tax credit if you spend that $100 on any candidate you want. I think that would democratize very significantly the political process in America and take us a long way away from these super PACs controlled by billionaires who are now buying elections.
So Bernie Sanders says, quote, "We are moving from a democratic society, one person, one vote, to an oligarchic society where elected officials are controlled by billionaires." Now, I think it's already the case that we're already ruled by billionaires. And our system is, at this point, in effect, a competitive oligarchy, because if you look at political science studies, such as one from 2014 from Dr. Gillens and Dr. Page, they find that our politicians don't represent us at all, and they actually represent special interest groups such as the NRA, such as billionaires, such as corporations. So really, when it comes to our influence, there's no effect at all, but the effect of influence from corporations, that's statistically significant. Now, this is incredibly problematic. Other studies are actually starting to show this as well. So now, if we were represented by politicians in Congress, then why is it the case that so many overwhelmingly popular policies can't get passed? Now, I'll give you some examples. Over 90% of Americans want money out of politics. Over 90% of Americans want universal background checks for guns. 63% of Americans believe in climate change, yet an entire party has been bought off by the fossil fuel industry and will not even admit that anthropogenic climate change is a reality. 95% want limits on coal-fired power plants. 63% of Americans want free community college. 60% of Americans support raising the minimum wage and want paid sick leave. Over 60% of Americans want paid maternity and paternity leave. 65% of Americans want infrastructure fixed. 67% of Americans are dissatisfied with income inequality, yet we keep cutting taxes for the rich and subsidizing large corporations. That doesn't make any sense. Now, 65% want to expand Social Security, and 70% don't want cuts. But what are Republicans talking about right now? Well, we're going to need to reform Social Security. We're going to have to privatize it or do something because, it's running out. But that's not true. Currently, Social Security is solvent until 2033, and as of 2016, Social Security will be solvent until 2034, and so on and so forth. So this is a false narrative that the politicians just want to dip into that cookie jar so that way they can give more subsidies to their buddies. So now getting back to these statistics, 46% of Americans, and that's a plurality, they think that free trade deals are harmful, yet they ran these types of deals such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership through anyway. Now, 54% of Americans support marriage equality, and Congress couldn't get it together to legalize it. They had to wait for the Supreme Court to do it. And that's just preposterous. Now, 75% of Americans, that's a huge majority, they say that the Iraq War wasn't worth the cost, yet, surprise, surprise, we're still there, even under a Democratic president. 51% of Americans support a single-payer healthcare system, yet Republicans voted over 50 times to repeal Obamacare, which was their policy before. It was it was created by the Heritage Foundation, and even Newt Gingrich endorsed it before. So when you go through all these policies, when you look at the statistics and what the American people want, it's very, very clear that we are not being represented. We can't get even the issues where 90% of us agree. 90% of us want universal background checks. That's, believe it or not, actually it's 93%. And we can't even agree on apple pie that much. Okay, let me elaborate. So 91% of Americans approve of apple pie. 93% of them approve of universal background checks for guns. But we can't get that. See, if more Americans are in support of something than apple pie, there's something fundamentally wrong with the system if we can't get it. So Bernie Sanders is 100% right. We have to do something. So now what we need is Supreme Court justices that will overturn precedent, not just from Citizens United, but also from McCutcheon and Bucky v. Vallejo. Now the best option is a constitutional amendment, which will mandate publicly funded elections. Now the best way to do that is to go through Wolfpack. Their idea was inspired by Lawrence Lessig and is ran by Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. And their goal is to go through the states to get a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics. Now, what they can do is if 3/4 of the states call for an Article 5 convention, you can actually circumvent Congress and codify a constitutional amendment that will be added to our Constitution. So that's really the only hope that I have at this point of getting money out of politics. But again, at the end of the day, getting back to Bernie Sanders, he's 100% right, just like he is on pretty much every other issue.